It would be redundant to say the Game Boy was feeling long in the tooth by 1995. The system had been born into the world feeling long in the tooth, running on tech that was a decade old by the time of its 1989 debut and saddled with an almost comically poor LCD screen. The Game Boy felt indescribably underpowered compared to Atari's contemporary portable competitor, the Lynx. The genius of the Game Boy came in the way Nintendo parlayed its apparent weaknesses into selling points. It ran on a dated chipset? Sure, but that tech was well documented and familiar to developers, who were able to squeeze maximum performance from the system. And because the system's processor had been around for so long, it was available for manufacturers to source for cheap, and it had been refined to become incredibly energy efficient. Likewise, the murky LCD screen was a cheap part that sipped battery juice. Game Boy kind of sucked, but the trade-off was that it was cheap, battery-friendly, and easy to develop for. The system outlasted the vastly more powerful Lynx, the vastly more powerful Game Gear, the vastly more powerful Turbo Express, the vastly more powerful Nomad. And thanks to its vast library of hits, it also wiped the floor with direct competitors like the Game Duck and Game Axe. Still, by 1995, Game Boy's star was on the wane. The system's release schedule had dropped off precipitously. 1995 would see barely a third as many new Game Boy titles as appeared in 1992. Game Boy remained gaming's handheld market leader, but only by default. No one seemed especially interested in launching a serious new competitor into that space, because perhaps all eyes were on the new 32-bit CD-ROM console war at the time. Whatever the case, Nintendo could tell the writing was on the wall for Game Boy. The time had come for a successor. And who better to lead the charge than the father of portable gaming himself, Gunpei Yokoi. At the time, Yokoi was preparing to retire from Nintendo after more than 3 incredibly fruitful decades with the company. His career there had begun as a humble assembly line worker in the 60s and ultimately led him to become the architect of some of the corporation's greatest hits: light gun toys, novelty amusements, remote control cars, game devices based on LCD watch tech, and of course, the Game Boy. It seemed fitting for Yokoi's swan song for his Nintendo tenure to be a final entry in the Game & Watch Game Boy lineage. Ever fascinated with the potential of gadgetry to create new forms of play, Yokoi seized upon an LED-based personal 3D screen concept called Private Eye to become the basis of Game Boy's successor. Private Eye wasn't a virtual reality system. The limitations of game and computer tech in the 90s made the idea of an affordable, consumer-level VR rig prohibitively expensive. Its creators had originally envisioned it as such, but the available processors simply lacked the horsepower to keep up with head tracking and resulted in severe nausea. Still, it served as a sort of halfway step between traditional game visuals and the dream of Johnny Mnemonic and Lawnmower Man. It was a self-contained system capable of delivering stereoscopic 3D visuals in a far more convincing fashion than the gimmicky Magic Eye posters that were so ubiquitous in the 90s. Developed by a Cambridge-based company called Reflection, Private Eye seemed a perfect match for Yokoi's visionary approach to tech. It would be an affordable way to deliver an interesting new concept in video games, opening the door to new forms of gaming at a price most consumers could stomach. Of course, Private Eye would bring to the table a materially different gaming experience than Game Boy offered. Single-screen 3D did not exist at the time, and Nintendo obviously couldn't ship a portable system that required players to carry special glasses with them everywhere. So rather than being a handheld device, the Game Boy's 3D follow-up would instead be head-mounted. The console would use a dual display with 2 small screens, one dedicated to each eye. The idea required a complex setup, but the principle behind it was sound. Players would wear a headset that projected slightly different images for each eye, and the disparity would result in a sort of parallax effect that their brains would combine into a single 3D visual stage. Parallax, of course, means that objects occupying the same space on each lens would read as foreground elements. On the other hand, objects appearing in different locations on the screens would read as elements in the background. The greater the distance between an object's position on the 2 screens, the further into the distance it would appear to be. The Private Eye took a very unusual approach to creating its 3D graphics. Rather than operating with the liquid crystal displays most portable systems had used to date, or trying to cram tiny Vectrex-style CRTs into its portable unit, it instead painted visuals by reflecting a light-emitting diode array by means of a rapidly spinning mirror. The luminosity of the LEDs addressed one of the Game Boy's fundamental shortcomings, a lack of screen lighting. But it also introduced new limitations. The Game Boy had used a monochromatic gray screen for reasons of cost management. but it could have incorporated a backlit color LCD, as the Lynx in Game Gear did. Virtual Boy, on the other hand, was effectively limited to monochromatic red on black as a matter of simple logistics. At the time, only one color of LEDs was widely available on the market: red. While blue, white, and green LEDs would enter the mainstream within a few years, they weren't available for Nintendo's product launch. But that fell within the parameters of Yokoi's vision. Whereas Sega had passed on the private eye tech due to its monochromatic limitations, it would, after all, have made a poor follow-up to the full-color Game Gear. It would work as a logical successor to the Game Boy's 4-shade monochrome, and thus the Virtual Boy. Indeed, Virtual Boy's direct video feed turns out to be essentially a souped-up version of Game Boy. The system delivers graphics in monochromatic 4-tone grayscale, effectively looking like a high-resolution Game Boy capable of pushing far more and far larger sprites, and multiple background layers. The Virtual Boy only gains its trademark red tones in the final step of the graphical rendering process, where the gray sprites are projected via red LEDs onto the internal mirrors, which splash them across the player's screens. On a level of raw horsepower, Virtual Boy should have been fundamentally capable of generating far more impressive graphics than its souped-up Game Boy sprites. The console ran on a 32-bit NEC chip that, rumor has it, was sourced from the processors left over once NEC's impressive but unpopular PCFX console tower hybrid failed. But Virtual Boy was constrained by the limitations of the LED array, and it was also generating two slightly distinct simultaneous video signals. The result was a kind of weird compromise of a system, based on 3D visuals, but not quite powerful enough to render proper 3D polygons at a respectable frame rate. Virtual Boy launched well after the Japanese debut of Sega Saturn and Sony's PlayStation, so players had already sorted out their ideas of what virtual and 3D should mean. Virtual Boy was not it. It didn't help that, according to a 2015 Fast Company profile by Ben Jedwards, Virtual Boy suffered a proverbial death by 1,000 paper cuts en route to market. Head tracking didn't work, so the promise of a virtual experience rang false. Meanwhile, according to Yokoi collaborator Takefumi Makino, the notion of sticking a computer processor directly in front of players' faces made some people at Nintendo nervous about the potential dangers of electromagnetic radiation. The manufacturer therefore shielded the system's chip with a metal plate, which curtailed the risk of cancer, but also added a bit of weight to the head-mounted device, enough that it wouldn't really work as a head-mounted device. Instead, Virtual Boy ended up being bulky enough that it needed to rest on a table stand to be usable. So it couldn't do true 3D, it wasn't actual virtual reality, and it wasn't a genuine portable system. Oh, and the LED screen tech tended to cause headaches with extended play. Nintendo ultimately recommended players take breaks every 15 to 30 minutes to avoid eye strain, and encouraged parents not to let young children use the system at all, lest it permanently damage their eyesight. Reactions to Virtual Boy mutated from intrigued to wary over the course of its pre-launch hype cycle. The press naturally wanted to be excited by this new Game Boy follow-up, but as more news, and eventually hands-on demos emerged, it was hard for anyone to see Virtual Boy as a potential success. Even Nintendo, it seemed, could stumble. But in fairness, all of the old guard console makers found themselves fumbling in the mid-90s. Certainly Sega whiffed it with the powerful but cumbersome and overpriced Sega CD, the disastrous 32X, and the baffling US Saturn launch. Atari disintegrated itself with the Jaguar and its CD add-on. Even newcomer platforms like 3DO and CDI had melted down by 1995. Perhaps inevitably, Nintendo joined the ranks of the fallen. The launch date of Project Reality, aka Ultra 64, aka Nintendo 64, slipped to mid-1996, giving the upstart PlayStation a healthy lead, and then Virtual Boy debuted to make things even worse. Virtual Boy didn't even survive long enough to make its way into Europe. The system shipped in July 1995 in Japan, and a month later in the US. By the end of December that same year, the Japanese business had drawn to a close with the quiet release of Athena's Virtual Bowling. 3 months later, the final American title, 3D Tetris, hit stores. And that was it. The Virtual Boy was gone, with consoles eventually marked down to about $20, 10% of their original retail price, to clear them out of stores alongside unwanted 32X units. Games still in development at the time of the console's demise were unceremoniously cancelled regardless of their completeness or worthiness. Japan Supply System's 3D platformer Bound High has gone down as a particularly devastating loss. Thus, Virtual Boy picked up a miserable reputation during its lifetime, and the stigma of its failure has continued to linger over the system to this day, nearly 25 years later. But is that really fair? Well, yes and no. Virtual Boy as a system was a shambles, Complicated, expensive, cumbersome, poorly supported, and painful to use. Its focus and design shifted so much in development that it no longer resembled an actual Game Boy successor, and that ultimately worked out to Nintendo's advantage. The success of Pokémon and the Game Boy Pocket system the following year allowed the company to quietly pretend like the Virtual Boy had never happened. Still, while that may have been to Nintendo's advantage, it's hard to see it as best for players. Even if Virtual Boy itself was a dud, the prolific designers in Nintendo R&D1's division supported it with some great games. Third-party software wasn't too shabby either, but a 50% success rate isn't too shabby. It sure beats the Game Boy lineup. There's something to be said for a quick, merciful death, but hidden within the Virtual Boy's tiny lineup are some overlooked classics as well as a couple of famous greats. The console fared surprisingly well when it came to rendering time-worn concepts and genres. Its one traditional platformer, Wario Land, is a masterpiece. At the same time, its top-down shooter, Vertical Force, is flawed but decent. Puzzle games, especially Panic Bomber and V-Tetris, are fine examples of the form, and the latter contains a mode that plays unlike any other interpretation of Tetris. Even its mundane titles, like Golf and Galactic Pinball, mostly turned out well. And it gave us the very first Mario sports title, which has become a franchise in its own right. Meanwhile, there's something to be said for Virtual Boy's forays into more cutting-edge titles, too. Its 3D visualization was a neat novelty. The system's controller, which included 2 D-pads, predicted the dual analog future of console interfaces and resulted in a handful of games that feel a few years ahead of their time in hindsight. Star Fox-like Red Alarm isn't great, but its behind-the-ship aerial combat uses the right D-pad to tweak camera angles in a way that you only saw in PC games like Descent in 1995. Meanwhile, weirdo Shin Megami Tensei spin-off Jak Brothers did the twin-stick shooter thing a decade early and without sticks. There's a lot of great stuff to be found on Virtual Boy if you take the time to investigate. In fairness though, the process of investigation has grown increasingly difficult over time. Nintendo didn't exactly make a ton of these things. Virtual Boy didn't even move 1 million units worldwide, which makes it by far the scarcest Nintendo system. Likewise, many of its games were released in vanishingly small quantities. There are fewer English-language copies of Jak Brothers in the world than there are gamers who discovered the Shin Megami Tensei series years later and want to explore the full franchise. And let's not even talk about the 4 insanely rare third-party Japanese releases from December 1995. And what systems do exist could stand to be made of sterner stuff. The display on Virtual Boy has a tendency to fail as it ages thanks to some engineer's decision to tack down critical cables with a glue that brittles and breaks with age. And again, Nintendo has been all too willing to wipe Virtual Boy out of its own history. Aside from occasional cheeky references in games like Animal Crossing and Tomodachi Life, you'd almost never know the thing existed. There's never been a Virtual Boy Virtual Console or any sort of compilation of games, despite the fact that the 3DS was practically designed to play host to such a thing. Not a single Virtual Boy release has ever been remade for another system either. In hindsight, the platform feels like some sort of video game Galapagos. Small, self-contained, cut off from the rest of the medium, it's full of evolutionary dead ends and strange one-offs that feel completely unknown to the larger world. Virtual Boy's library deserves better. But on the other hand, its poor visibility means there's a lot of pleasure to be found in making your way through the console's library. For every disastrous Virtual League Baseball or Virtual Lab to be found on the console, there's also a Jak Brothers or a Virtual Bowling. Even if Nintendo never finds room in its collective corporate heart to repatriate Virtual Boy into the annals of its self-curated history, the system and its games are out there, simply begging to be explored by curious gamers who are eager to see what happens when gaming's most enduring company stumbles over its good intentions. As for Gunpei Yokoi, he did retire from Nintendo after Virtual Boy, but not until he had delivered the marvelous Game Boy Pocket as a final statement before venturing off to create a proper next-generation Game Boy in the form of Bandai's Wonder Swan. It's not a happy ending, since Yokoi's life was cut short in a traffic accident the following year, but neither is it wholly a tragic finale either.